Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. We're going to have to get started. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe, whoever you love, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm an instructor of adult religious education. And today we're going to continue our comparative religion series and talk about Confucianism, society, community, and ritual in China. Okay. I'm excited about this topic. It's an interesting one, and I hope you'll find it interesting too. I want to remind everyone that we do have a course webpage. The URL is kind of tricky to get to, but it's sites.google.com/view comparative religion. I try to keep this up to date. I don't do a very good job, but I try. It has links it does, however, have links to the past classes if you want to find them. They're also available on the YouTube channel if you want to find those. So if you miss a class or whatever, you can go there. And I also try to keep lists of additional readings, things I recommend, that sort of thing there so you can find additional resources. I want to remind everyone that last time, let's see, I'm struggling with our mouse here. I see the problem. All right. Last time we spoke about Chinese folk religion and the imperial cult. So that was our topic from last week. I dropped this and now I'm having a hard time making it work. There we go. See, maybe is that going to work or is it? Okay, I think I can make this work. Maybe. So last time we spoke about the comparative religion on the Chinese folk religion, and we talked about the imperial cult, and specifically we discussed issues like the agrarian origins of Chinese religion, yin and yang, the five elements, wuxing, qi, and divine supernatural beings, including gods, ancestors, ghosts, and how they relate to those, and divination, using the oracle bones and the I Ching specifically. One of the questions that was asked there is how many people in China actually believe this stuff. I think, Leroy, you asked that. So I went and digging and found a few surveys. And as I said at the time, I gave the basic idea, but here we get some more concrete examples. A lot more people believe this than say that they have a religion or will ascribe to any specific religious identity. So, for example, 33% will say that they believe in the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, which is much smaller than the fraction who will say they are Buddhist. The same with the number who will burn incense to deities or believe in Taoist deities, etc. Here's a more detailed breakdown of that. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is, again, a part of the Pew survey. And they've broken it down by age on the right for those interested in a breakdown by age. And you can see which things at the top the children do less often than the parents, and at the bottom the things the children do more often than the parents. So you can kind of see the trajectory of some of these beliefs. For example, children much more often visit a site to pray for good luck, probably because they're busy taking tests. And we'll talk more about that with Confucianism today. And at the top, these are the people who care very much about choosing auspicious days for special events, like lucky days, etc. And you'll see the children do that much more. Young people do that more often than older people, or less often than older people. So that the one that's becoming less common and the one that's becoming more common is at the top and bottom. Okay. Today we're going to talk about Confucianism. I think what we did last time actually sets the stage fairly well. I'm going to do an introduction, a historical background, then the life of Confucius, the core teachings and philosophy, the impact Confucianism had on later history and culture, and then in conclusion, though, the reason we teach as a Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and we recognize that that's difficult, and we take truth and meaning everywhere we can find it. Right? We try to find things in other groups that we admire, and we might imitate that, and we take something else and we say, we don't like that, we won't do that, and we pick and choose. This is why we do comparative religion here, and I think the point is never just to criticize or to make fun of. The point is always to understand and find ways that what we study can bring us greater light in our own search for truth and knowledge. Confucianism, however, is so, to some extent, so antithetical, I think, to what the Unitarian Universalist tradition might be that normally the way I do that is I teach the subject with the goal that you will understand, and then I leave it up to you to come to conclusions. And I'm going to do that again, but if you'll grant me a little bit of license, for maybe the first time today, this time I'm going to take a moment. It's not the first time, I digress often, but I'm going to actually take a section where I want to talk about my own thoughts about Confucianism and how I use it and think about it in terms of my own search for truth and meaning. And it doesn't have to be the way you do it. Like I said, whatever you believe, you're welcome here. But I'll show you just a little bit about how I do it, and maybe that'll help some of you see value in what we discuss in a place that you might find to be difficult in terms of finding truth and value in it. Now, the other thing I want to, the first thing I think we want to say about Confucianism is if the idea of religion and of religious identity specifically is a Western one. In fact, it's the Western groups, the Western society that first described religion as a thing that separated the secular and the sacred. For the rest of the world, there is no distinction. This is religion, this is secular, that's a foreign concept. So what is a religion is also a foreign concept, one that they had to import from us. And in fact, when China first started looking around for words to translate the Western word for religion, they had no word for it. And they picked something that's, at first at least, I don't know if it's still what's commonly used, that meant something along the lines of superstition. But that doesn't quite fit the Western category of religion, and it didn't fit theirs. So when you go to the West, and polling agencies in America, we love to ask people what their religion is because it's very definitive of other things. You can predict politics and economic status and all sorts of things from their answer to the religion question. And when we ask that question of people in China, Taiwan, Japan, we get strange answers. And the reason we get strange answers is because they don't necessarily identify with their religion or as a religion. It's not part of their identity. One of the reasons religion holds on in the U.S. so strongly is because people feel like it's part of their identity. They may not attend church anymore, but they're evangelical anyway, because that's part of their identity. It's become an identity thing. Okay, so if that's not part of the Chinese identity, you find answers like this. 0.2% of people in China, Taiwan, Japan, and the Republic of Korea will answer a survey that says they are Confucius as a religion. Part of that is because religious is not an identity itself. In fact, few of them will say they have any religion, even though many of them will say they do what we would consider religious things. In that previous list, the number of people saying they burn incense to their ancestors, for example, is much higher than the number who will claim any religion when you ask them what religion they are. And then Confucian especially, though, it falls prey to this because they don't think of many of them do not think of Confucianism itself as a religion. Rather, it's a philosophy, a way of life, a political ideology. It's like saying I'm a communist or as a capitalist, I'm a Confucian. It's a philosophy. And so it doesn't qualify as a religion to them. And yet Confucianism shows up on every world religion, comparative religion book. If you pick up a comparative religion book like this one, it has an entire chapter on Confucianism. Why is it that we have chapters on a religious subject where the adherents themselves don't necessarily think it's religious? It's a religious subject. Now, again, part of the point of this one is that very few people will claim to be Confucius, but very many of them, as a religious identity, but very many of them will believe Confucian philosophy, will accept Confucian philosophy. They are deeply Confucian. So Confucianism, I believe, is one of the most influential philosophies, ideas in the entire world. It has had more influence on the world than almost any other. And yet very few people will claim it as an identity. And we have even a question of whether it is a religion. But it is undoubtedly in every single comparative religion book you will ever pick up. Why? What's happening here? Well, Confucianism challenges our notions of what a religion is. It's not about the worship of a certain god, although Confucius himself spoke about heaven often as an impersonal force, or maybe even a personal being. It seemed to have a will, and he talked about living in accordance with the will of Tian, heaven. But the topic of his discussion was always about how to live. He also spent a lot of time talking about how you should follow certain religious rituals. That was important to Confucius. But that was because it was important for society and for our connection to the universe. So Confucianism is sort of a secular and yet has religious overtones. And so much like Unitarian Universalists, we challenge the notion, the conservative, the traditional notion of what a religion is. And if you remember one of my Introduction to Religious Studies lectures, I gave an entire lecture on how to define religion. And I said at the time, the only thing that religious scholars agree on is that they don't agree on how to define a religion. Because however you define it, there will be a group that will challenge your assumptions. And Unitarian Universalists do a good job of that, and so do Confucianism. So I think the real lesson we should take from this isn't that Confucianism isn't a religion, it's that religion is a fuzzy category, and that we need to rethink our own notion, again, it's a Western notion, of religion itself as a separate thing from the rest of society. All right, you've seen me use this before. This is again from Stephen Prothero. This is how he likes to not define a religion, but sum up a religious tradition so that you get a very quick idea of what religion is. And you notice last time I put Chinese folk religion on here, and when I got to the exemplars, down, how do I get the mouse on that side of the page? Come on. Oh, there we go. Right here. I had copied this line and then tried to modify it, and it still said Christopher Hitchens was the exemplar for Chinese folk religion, which is obviously pretty silly. And so I've tried to fix this one for you, if you remember my last lecture. But then this is the one we're going to talk about today. Every religious tradition can be summed up in terms of a problem. All of them, the one thing they have in common, there's this idea all religions are the same. They're not. But the one thing they do have in common is that they all see that there's a problem with the world. But you can see just how different they are by noticing how different they think the problem is. They don't even define the problem the same way. They each have a problem, a solution, a technique for achieving or implementing the solution, and exemplars that help you figure out how people whose example you can follow so that you can implement the solution. In this case, the problem is chaos itself, disorder. The solution is order, and the techniques for achieving that order are education, filial piety, ritual, and etiquette. And the exemplars are then Confucius, the scholars, parents who become the exemplars for their children, and officials in the governmental officials themselves. And so you can see government as a technique for implementing this order. And again, any attempt to do this will miss important things and will overly simplify. But you get an idea, and then we can dive into how that maybe isn't quite right and all this other stuff. But it gives you a very quick introduction and overview. All right, historical context. Oh, go ahead. You're right.
Yes, when you use the word order, when they used the word order, have their religion attached to it so that there was something specific? Order can take a lot of forms as we view order. What did they think it was?
Well, I think if I look at the Analects and try to figure out what Confucius was talking about, he seems to be interested in societal disorder, primarily, which is why Confucianism is so different from other religions, because it's about how to order society, less about how to make God less mad at you. In that sense, it's very different from Christianity, right? Christianity is all about how God is mad at you need to make him less mad at you. And Confucianism is about our society is disordered. How do we get that order back? And in fact, I think this historical context section illustrates that fairly well. Although I need to clarify, he did care about the order between earth and heaven, and the ordered society was supposed to be one ordered according to the will of heaven. And so, again, heaven looks almost like this impersonal force, which represents the world as it should be by divine or natural decree. I think it's very similar to what a lot of natural philosophers or naturalists will call the nature of the universe, right? We need to order it according to the nature of the universe. On the other hand, it seems to have a personal force or will. You can lose the mandate of heaven, etc. Let's talk about the historical context, though, because I think that helps answer your question, because it helps us see what he was worried about. Many people will divide Chinese history into three main groups or epochs. Ancient China, the imperial China, that starts with the first person who called himself an emperor rather than a king, bad translations of both those words, but we do the best we can. And then modern China, which is 1912 to the present after the last imperial emperor. So let's dive into ancient China for just a second. We can break that up into several different dynasties, but the one that will concern us here is the Zhou, and concern us most is the Zhou here. And you'll notice the spring and autumn period is an overlapping period with the Zhou. It's the end of the Zhou dynasty, and the Zhou dynasty lasted for a long time, if you look at those dates. On the other hand, for most of its existence, it was in decline and controlled very little, actually controlled very little. And that's the spring and autumn period. This is this time period when the Zhou dynasty is in decline and starting to lose their power and authority. And it leads inexorably to what we call the Warring States period, which is where each of these different groups, I should point out, Confucius lived in the spring and autumn period, and this is near the end of it, which is important for understanding his theories. I'm sorry that this is loading. Okay. Historical context. The Warring States period flows inexorably from the spring and autumn period, which is a time when each of these different groups fragmented further and then started fighting, and they began slowly conquering their neighbors until one of them became dominant and started the first empire. The first imperial period begins when China was again reunited under the first individual who called himself an emperor. And so what Confucius sees as he grows up is the loss of power from the king. He sees governors, local governors, usurping things that used to belong to the power of the king, usurping titles, rituals, and authority that used to belong to the king. And he recognized that this was going to lead to civil war. So he lived in a time when civil war was sort of on the horizon and you could see it coming. And he warned everybody, and he wasn't wrong. And so he said, the solution to this is we got to get back to letting the king be the king and stop usurping the authority of the king by these local governors. We need to respect authority. We need to follow the government. We need a strong central government that's in charge again, etc. So, again, this is why I say it to some extent. I'm sure we can see problems with this idea, but I also hope we can see where it came from historically. In fact, one of the ways to think of Confucius, it's an unfair way because it compares it to modern politics in an unfair way, but Confucius was interested in making China great again. And from his perspective, the way to make China great again was to look backwards in time and look at the Zhou and say when they were in charge and when they actually had power, that was when China was great, before we were killing each other. Because they had already started fighting in his life. And he saw the bloodshed and the hunger that this internal strife was creating. So Confucius lived from 551 to 479, right at the end of that spring and autumn period. His name is actually Kongku. Will you say this for me? Confucius. Well, yes, Confucius. I was trying to do the first one. He was born Kongqi or something similar to that. Say that? Kongchu. And then he became Confucius or Master Kong, and sometimes shortened to Kongzi and Kongzi. And so you can see where the Western Jesuits got Confucius, which is obviously not his name. They're trying to make it easier for us poor Westerners to pronounce. As I just showed, I can't do it right anyway. We need your help. But this is why they Westernized it, but it's also kind of unfair. We've got this funny Western name that has nothing to do with his real name. I'm going to use it because no one knows who I'm talking about here if I talk about Confucius. But Confucius is a Westernization of his actual name. And we know most about his life from a book called The Analects of Confucius. It's actually a very small book, maybe this long. You can read it in a day if you're serious about it. And it's a collection of rather pithy sayings. This is where we get, the Westerns, when they mock Confucius, which is, again, I think an unfair thing, but Westerners will often mock Confucius with, Confucius say, and then they'll have some grammatically poor statement that Confucius never said, and it's some joke, and they've turned Confucianism into a joke, and I think that's actually very unfortunate. But they're getting this from the fact that the Analects are a collection of very short, pithy sayings. If you read them, that's how they read. And I didn't read the whole thing. I read a good chunk of them. I tried to work my way through the whole thing, and I ran out of time. But again, they're these short, pithy sayings. From those pithy sayings, supposedly by Confucius or some of his students, we get the only biographical information we have about Confucius. So when people talk about what Confucius said or what Confucius's life was like, which I'm about to do, I'm reminded of this modern attempt to do the historical Jesus. And I want to point out that this is utter folly. We have no idea who the historical Jesus is. And if anyone tells you they think they've figured it out and they can tell you what the historical Jesus really taught, apart from what's in the Gospels, they're wrong. We don't know the historical Jesus, and we do not know the historical Confucius. We know the Confucius as portrayed by the Analects, and the Analects were written by followers of Confucius who remembered his teachings years and years after he died. So I don't know what the historical Confucius was really like any more than I know what the historical Jesus was like. And although there are people who will write scholarly sounding books who will try to tell you for both, I think they're wrong. I think this is a fool's errand. But to some extent, it is not important. I know his real life matters, who he really was matters, but what I will call the literary Jesus or the literary Confucius is the individual that has been presented to us in the texts we have. That's the character that influenced the world in both cases. So I can tell you what the Jesus of the Bible thought or said about different topics, and I can be very sure that I'm right, assuming I can actually pay attention to the text and read it without too much bias. But the same is true here. So when I talk about Confucius' life, I am talking about the literary Confucius. I'm not even going to try to tell you who the historical Confucius was. I hope the two are sort of the same, or similar, at least, in this case. In the case of Jesus, I'm well aware of the fact that they may be wildly different. And in this case, it's also possible that they are different. But this is sort of the outline of his life as we know it. We think he was born to an aristocratic family, although that has been challenged. His father died at a young age, we know this, and because of that, he grew up in poverty. He overcame his poverty, maybe because he had an aristocratic family, maybe just because he worked really hard, but he was known as a bit of a prodigy, and he overcame his poverty to become highly educated, good at archery, and well knowledgeable of all the classic texts around him, and he was lauded as a very intelligent and well-known and understood scholar. And so he tried to take his scholarship on the road, where he would go to, at this time in the spring and summer autumn period, just before the warring states, the different governors were seeking wise scholars to be in their court and to be part of their retinue of government officials. And they thought that by having the most intelligent government officials who would tell them how to rule appropriately, they would get an advantage over their neighbor. And so Confucius wandered around trying to convince people to hire him. And he said I think some of us would consider to be arrogant things, like if they would just hire me, like within a year, I could fix all the world's problems. He thought he had a solution to all the societal ills. If they would just hire him and do what he said, he could fix all these problems. And understandably, several of these governors did not appreciate what he was saying, and he failed very miserably. He died, before he died, he did die without ever having achieved his ambition of having a governor who would actually listen to him so that he could change the world. He thought he could solve the world's problems, and he didn't solve the world's problems because no one would listen to him. So just before he died, he gave up on this whole political aspirations and founded a small school where instead of trying to change the world himself, he would teach the next generation who would then change the world. And this actually sort of worked. He became very influential later on but far after his death he became influential. So then his followers later composed the Analects in their remembrance of and tradition of what Confucius, the master, had previously said. I'm going to give you an example, a flavor of what these things are like by reading the first one. The master said, "To learn and then, in its due season, put what you have learned into practice. Isn't that a great pleasure? And to have a friend visit from somewhere far away, isn't that a great joy? When you're ignored by the world, like I am, and yet bear no resentment." I can see there's no resentment there at all. Isn't that a great nobility? I'm being facetious, but he's at least saying he himself claimed he failed to be the noble person he was extolling. But he gives us an ideal that we should strive for, an ideal that he knew or seems to have known. In what I read from the Analects, he seems to have known that he failed to live up to. But this is, as a teacher, I know this is true. I often do the exact same thing. I tell my students, especially when I was Mormon or whatever, I was teaching, I would tell my students to live a perfect life like Jesus. And I knew full well that I didn't live a perfect life, but I was trying, darn it, and I wanted them to try. And so I actually, it's really hard to not sympathize with Confucius and Confucianism as a teacher, because he is maybe the patron, to put it in Western terms, he's the patron saint of teachers, telling students that they should really love learning. You should love coming to my classes, dang it. Well, of course I sympathize with that, right? It resonates with me very much. Okay. As a teacher, go ahead.
Do we have any idea how long after his death the Analects were written down? It's a big question, obviously, with the Gospels.
It is. There is a text at the end that is a Great Courses series on the Annals themselves, just an entire college course on the Annals. And I will show you that reference. You can look it up if you're interested. I think in chapter 2 or 3, he discusses the composition. And so I listened to the whole thing from memory. I believe he said most of them were written down within about 200 years. But it was a long time, but they continued, and their form continued to change as different sayings were rejected and others were put in from multiple sources combined for many years after that. And I think he was saying, 500 years later, it was still in flux. So the core starts at an earlier date, and then it's in flux for many more years after that. That's from memory, so please go listen to the actual source for that, and I'll show you the source at the end. Confucius claimed that his job, again, as somebody who wanted to make, I'm saying this is probably a bad idea, but make China great again, right? It's probably a really bad thing to say. It's not fair to him. But as somebody interested in that, my point is he looked to the past as the great time that he wanted to restore. So Confucius didn't claim he was presenting new wisdom. He claimed he was trying to convey the wisdom of the past. And so what was the wisdom of the past? Well, these are the 5 what we call Confucian classics. Some of them may have not actually been written before, but he took classics such as these, and these became the traditional classics after him, and tried to convey those teachings, the wisdom of the past, to his students. It wasn't about his wisdom, it was his collection of the wisdom of the past that he was conveying. So there's the classics of poetry, which is an anthology of folk songs, mythological accounts, and religious hymns. And you can see, I think, why Confucianism looks to some extent like a religion. It also has the Book of Documents, a collection of political speeches and essays. You can imagine like the collection of political speeches being one of the core documents of a U.S. group religion. Probably not, although the U.S. Constitution and the writings of the Founding Fathers are close for some of our more interesting markings. We also have the Book of Rites, a collection of liturgical writings on ritual. We have the I Ching, which we discussed last time as a divination manual, full of philosophical musings as well. And the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is where we get the term Spring and Autumn period, which is a historical record of the state of Lu, where Confucius was born. Later, we get what's called the four Confucian books, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, which are, I believe, excerpts from some of the other stuff. Then we get the Analects himself added, and we get the writings of an individual named Mencius, who was a Confucian who lived many years later. And I used to have a section on him in this talk, and I cut it because I ran out of time. But I don't know how I can teach a class on Confucius and not mention Mencius. His book is one of the core Confucian texts, and we're not even going to talk about him or his life. It's just a thing. So Confucians are then Ru. And again, I think here you can see the distinction between Confucianism and religion in the Chinese way of thinking. The Confucians are just the scholars, the Ru. Ru is a term meaning the scholar. The scholar of what? Well, those previous books we talked about. So they are the officials and the scholars, the Ru. So what were the teachings of classical Confucianism? Whenever you simplify this way, you're going to mess up, but I have to do something. And so I think there are three things that seem to be core to me: education, filial piety, and ritual. So let's talk about each of those in turn. Education. We have to contrast this with Taoism, which we will discuss next month. But this idea is, I think, best seen in contrast. If you've ever seen The Empire Strikes Back, Yoda says, "You must unlearn what you have learned." That is a Taoist sort of thing to say. The Confucianism saying is, you must learn to be fully hearted, to be a scholar, a full-hearted human. So for Confucianism, it's all about learning, teaching, educating, and Confucius' birthday is Teacher's Day in Taiwan, to give you an idea of how this works. But again, the idea is to learn, and not just to learn math for math's sake, like we would think in the West, or to learn something so you can have a job. That's not it. It's about learning to be an ethical, full human being, a human being in proper balance with themselves and with the world around them. We do that in family, primarily in family, but in hierarchical relationships in family. And here we'll see some of the reasons why Confucian thought is at odds with Western thought itself, and especially with what we would consider Unitarian Universalist principles to some degree. And that is that every relationship is illustrated by the family. The family is the core relationship, and the other relationships are like extensions thereof. So the relationships we can discuss are father and child, which is hierarchical, the father and the child. Elder brother and younger brother, also hierarchical. Husband and wife, in their view, hierarchical. Ergo, we see the problem. Older friend, younger friend, hierarchical. Ruler and subject, hierarchical. But here we also see this concept that the ruler and subject should be like the father and child, in the sense that the father should have the child's best interests at heart and should not be therefore taxing the child so that they can build a big palace. These are the sorts of things Confucius said. You should care about feeding the people. You should care about making sure the people are right. And one of the arguments that came up is, should you rule with a strong fist, right? Sometimes fathers do that. Should you punish the child until they listen and obey? And Confucius said, if you do that, they will obey for a little while out of fear, but what will grow is resentment. Instead, if you live an ethical life yourself and set an example, they will follow by their example and society will be harmonious, etc. So you can see this hierarchical thing going on, but you can also, I hope, see that he's proposing a benevolent hierarchy, which I know is a fraught term. There's this concept of benevolent patriarchy that never ends up being benevolent, right? But that's the idea here, is benevolent. And to some extent, Confucius is suggesting a softer version of power than the people around him and that he argues with at the time, which is, I think, not the position we take, because he is proposing a much more hierarchical version than we would, but it was much more soft and loving than the ones around him. And he emphasized this idea of kind-heartedness, which is the core concept of how a ruler should rule and how a son should interact with his father. A son interacts with his father because he loves his father. The father interacts with the son because he is also kind-hearted and loves the Son in proper relationship. Okay, I'm going to read a couple of these that I hope will give you the idea of how this worked in his thoughts. A person who respects their parents and their elders would hardly be inclined to defy their superiors. A person who is not inclined to defy their superiors will never foment a rebellion. And to respect parents and elders is therefore the foundation of human heartedness, of being a full human. You can see, by the way, why the Chinese Communist Party, as a revolutionary party, trying to foment a rebellion, did not appreciate Confucius. You can also see why the current Communist Party, who would prefer there were no rebellions, likes Confucius. We'll get to this in a minute, but this is actually plays a role. Let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, the father a father, the son a son. This one is important because one of his students asked him, how do you solve the world's political problems? And he says, stand in the place where you are. Follow your duty, your place, your position. Don't pretend to more than you are. This is what was happening. Remember when these local governors were taking the roles of the king? The governor should be a governor, not a king. That's what's causing all of our problems. The child should be a child and shouldn't pretend to be the parent. If we all stand in the place where in our own role and stick to our roles and don't step out of them, we will solve the world's problems. Again, we can see problems with this, but I hope I will later show that there's also some wisdom in it. So what we want to do is find the wisdom without taking it too far, because it can go too far. Let me read one more here. The person of noble character seeks harmony, not uniformity. Right? Equality is not the goal. Harmony is the goal, and sometimes harmony requires hierarchy. Okay. Again, this is this concept of a benevolent hierarchy. But by benevolent, he is very demanding in that benevolence. He's actually very aggressive, and he says, never inflict on others what you yourself do not desire. Remember, years before Jesus. But he's saying the same thing that is later called the golden rule. By the way, I take issue with the golden rule because the golden rule says do unto others as you would have them do to you. But if I do to other people what I want them to do to me, I might sit and argue with them all day. And at some point I have to realize other people don't like that the same way I do. So I should treat other people the way they want to be treated instead of the way I want to be treated. Which means I have to understand them enough to understand how they want to be treated. So first I have to understand. The golden rule is very challenging. Well, what I would call the platinum rule in this case is very challenging because to do it, first I have to understand them. And then I have to treat them not the way I want to be treated, but the way they want to be treated. Nevertheless, this idea is the hallmark of moral philosophies throughout the world, and it is very challenging, very demanding, and Confucius imposes it on his students. This is what we want. And this is the sort of thing that might actually make a hierarchy benevolent, a really benevolent hierarchy, if you actually do this and behave this way. A ruler would not impose on his subjects. By the way, that's the way he says it, why he says it this way. He's thinking about a ruler and their subjects. A ruler would not impose on their subjects something they wouldn't want imposed on them if they were the subject instead of the ruler. Do you see that? I think that's actually a very good way to rule if you are going to rule. Okay. The other thing worth pointing out is this concept of remonstrance, which is a funny English word, but what it means in English at least is someone of lesser status telling someone of higher status that they're wrong. So here we have a picture of a Chinese official going to the emperor and saying, with the purpose of saying, you are wrong. And Confucian stories and myths and legends are full of this. So we think about this idea of hierarchy as you will do what the leader says, period. You will always obey the leader. And for Confucius, it's about having what they called filial piety, which isn't just for the father, but for any leader. You should have proper filial piety for your leader, which means you respect them. It means you follow their instructions when important, and you also will tell them when they're wrong, bluntly and with courage. Even if it means they put you to death, you tell them when they're wrong, because you're not really being an honorable subject if you're not willing to tell them when they're wrong. So how would this play out in the family? One of the problems that I've heard Christians talk about, honor your father and your mother. Well, I have a friend whose father beat them. I have another friend whose father sexually abused them. How do you honor somebody like that? And I think if you were to ask Confucius that question, I'm making this up, but from what little I've been able to gather of his writings, I think his answer would be, you respect them, you tell them how much you love them, and you tell them that they're wrong in no uncertain terms, and you stand up for that strongly, powerfully, and you say, no, that is not appropriate, that is not right, and it will cause harm to you and to society and all around us, so you need to stop. This is not blind obedience of the sort that it gets characterized as. This is actually, since we do have hierarchical relationships, even in the West, this is a good way to think about it. If your boss is wrong, at some point, do you dare tell them? Do you have the courage to stand up and say, no, that's not right? But can you do that in a way where they recognize that you're doing it because you care about them and about the success of the company, not because you're arrogant, not because you want to be in charge, but because you want them to be in charge and you want them to be the best in charge person they can be. And he is probably correct that this is the best way to change somebody who is wrong and in charge. Whereas the you're wrong, I'm right, you're stupid, why are you in charge, I should be in charge way that someone in our culture might be encouraged to do that is not very effective. So again, this is not the sort of hierarchy that I think it gets characterized as. All right, ritual. The next aspect is ritual. Now, ritual has several aspects. Because we have a category of religion as separate from secular world, ritual has, by definition, for us, a religious meaning. But in Confucianism, it's not just religious ritual. It certainly is religious ritual. Burning incense to your ancestors. There's an instance where one of Confucian's students came to him and said, is it really right that we sacrifice this sheep to the ancestors all the time? The sheep are expensive. Can't you think of something better we could do with these sheep? And Confucius says, heck no, you sacrifice that sheep, gosh darn it, and you shouldn't care how much it costs because it's important. And we have this same person who when his student died, they came to him and said, one of his students came to him and said, we should offer this elaborate funeral for him. And Confucius said, that's not appropriate for us. I couldn't even do that. I didn't have enough money to do that for my own son. How could I do it for my favorite student, no matter how much I loved him and cared about him? I can't do this thing. That's his father's place, and we're going to honor him, but we're not going to spend extra money on him. So it's this interesting idea of just the right amount of ritual, as portrayed by tradition, because tradition is what binds everything together. But again, for Confucius, ritual, although it can be, in these sense, sacrifices for the dead, etc., we would think of them as religious, it does not have to be. Confucius was very interested in this world over the next. When one of his students asked how to best serve the ancestors, he told them, while it is that you are not able to serve man, how can you serve the spirits of the dead? While you do not understand life, how can you understand death? I'm not here to tell you what happens when you die. I'm not here to tell you how to serve the ancestors. I'm here to tell you how to live your life. And oh, by the way, how you should live your life includes offering the proper sacrifices to the ancestors, which he will say elsewhere. But for this person, who is all interested in the next life and how the next life works, Confucius is not what this is about. It's a unabashedly this worldly religion, if it is a religion at all. And so when we talk about ritual, there is a whole other class of ritual, which really is not distinct, but we think it's distinct because of the words we've been taught. But when we open ourselves to a different cultural context, we realize that ritual is all around us. And so I have friends who really hate ritual. They think it's dumb, but they're thinking of religious ritual, and they miss the fact that their society would not function without ritual, and that they engage in ritual all the time. From how we shake hands when we first meet somebody, to how we raise our hand when we want to speak in a class, when we're asking a question, to what we do when people get married. Why is it that we throw rice? Why do we jump in a car and drive off? All the things we do, all of it is a form of etiquette and or ritual. How you sit, whether you stand when someone walks into the room, the rituals we perform when Queen Elizabeth is inaugurated as queen or king, when the king is crowned. Those are all rituals. Some of them are entirely secular. Some of them are religious. Some of them are secular with religious overtones, funerals, weddings, this sort of thing. But ritual is very important for society. And Confucius recognized this importance and thought that we could fix society if we just fixed the rituals and fixed the etiquette and stuck to them. Now, imagine how broken our society would be if we didn't have a good ritual for how you greet somebody. When you meet somebody and you have to introduce yourself, we know what to say. Imagine how hard it would be to come up with something to say each time if there was not a set formula. So by imagining that, hopefully you understand how important these rituals can be for society, for social structure, and therefore maybe understand why Confucius emphasized them. It was said that if his mat was not straight, Confucius, did not sit on it. This is a very, so you can interpret that two ways. One, Confucius is OCD. Or two, he cared about the etiquette of the meal so much that he would correct the etiquette of the meal before he would proceed, because he believed that those small pieces of etiquette and practicing them is a way to practice getting your heart in line with these concepts so that you will practice the right forms of etiquette and stuff when you meet the king. And all of society will function better when we properly follow these ritual concepts. The goal here is harmony. And harmony in the realms of family, society, government, and heavens, and humans with the heavens, produced through education, especially of the ethical qualities of the human, filial piety with the family, but also with our governors and our other relationships, and ritual practice. So that's the core, I think, philosophical concept of Confucianism. So what happens to this after Confucius dies by having trained a bunch of students but never having served in government? Well, Imperial China begins at the end of the Warring States, when the Qin Dynasty conquers, and they rule for, 15 years, something like this, and that's it. Very short-lived. They were very opposed to Confucianism, and they were in what we call the legalistic tradition. This is the tradition that I said Confucius argued with when they said the way you rule is you enforce everything and you make people afraid of you, and it did not work. They fell apart, and the Confucian theory about why it failed is because they were legalistic instead of Confucian. And so this is the case in point that later Confucians will use to argue for the superiority of their philosophy. And he persecuted, by the way, the Confucians, the Confucian officials, because they were telling him to be a nicer king, presumably, than he was. And so then the Han Dynasty rises to take their place, and the Han Dynasty will elevate Confucianism to kind of the state orthodoxy. And they will take the writings of Confucius and others and turn them into the exam, which I'll talk about in a minute. Neo-Confucianism is a later development. I don't have time to talk about it. And then but Confucianism will wax and wane, but remain very important until the fall of the Chinese imperial dynasties in 1912. Less than 100, or just over 100 years ago. Let's talk about the examinations. These are called sometimes the Confucian examinations, and what began in the Han Dynasty. And what would happen is this was a technocracy form of government where you would go to school, you would learn, you would take a test. The people who got the best grades on the test became the officials of the government. So the way you progressed, the way you achieved status, the way and found your way out of poverty was to become a government official. The way you did that was by passing tests on things like the Analects of Confucius. You had to know them very well, and you'd be able to write very good essays about the meaning and interpretation of these Analects and the other texts that went with them. Modern China begins with the fall of the Qing Dynasty, and we have this brief Republican era, and then that coincides with a very horrible period of colonial interference, and there were all sorts of problems created by colonialism, which still causes problems with our relationship with the Chinese governments today, because of the dumb things that Western European nations did to them in the past. But it should also be pointed out that there were problems with the dynasty before the colonial period, and the colonial period in part happens because the dynasty is starting to fall on its own, and then the Western European powers stepped in and caused problems into this vacuum created by some of these problems. We have a brief Republican era, which ends with the communist present. So let's go through some of those sections. Colonialism. The Chinese response, and we're not going to go through all the horrible things they did. This is not a history class, this is a religion class. But the Chinese response to what was going on was to say, we need reform. We need to fix our government so that the West can't keep walking all over us. And there were two main camps. One was to double down on Confucianism and to turn it into a unifying, almost Protestant religion, which would give us the same power that Christianity gave the West. And the other was that all of our problems are because of that old guy Confucius who was all about tradition, and our traditions have let us down. We need to abandon him completely. And these two kind of warred with each other right up until today. You can see both kind of strains going on sometimes, I think. The last emperor was what we call this child emperor. Puyi, say his name for me, Puyi?
Qing dynasty.
What is it?
The Qing is pronounced Qing.
Qing. Oh, no, Puyi.
Oh, Puyi.
Puyi, okay, thank you. He was the last emperor. He was very young. I think he started reigning when he was 2, and he abdicated the throne when he was 6. But notice that the last imperial exam happened just before he took the throne in 1905, when at some point someone pointed out that writing essays on the Analects of Confucius probably isn't the best way to choose people who will be the leaders of our government as we deal with Western European powers who are conquering and abusing us, etc. So at some point they abandoned at least the Confucian essays as the key to the government positions. After the World War II and the invasion of Japan, there were 2 approaches to Confucianism, one in Taiwan, which shouldn't have a capital A, sorry about that, and one in the mainland. Now the mainland was conquered by the communists, and the Republicans eventually fought a losing war further as they were pushed further and further south until they left and went to Taiwan, where they held on today. Now, as tensions with China and the U.S. have risen, I think normally I don't do so much of the modern parts of a religious tradition. It's mostly the origins and the ancient part. But I think in as much as tensions are high right now, especially over Taiwan, it's worth it, I think, to know a little bit about at least how the religious part influenced what's going on here. Taiwan had a very different approach to Confucianism than mainland. Taiwan embraced Confucian ideas and set them up. And they said, oh, we're not quite, some things are wrong. We admit we're not going to have it's feudal, it's monarchical, it's all about the emperor. We're not going to have an emperor. We're a democracy. But you know what? We're going to embrace Confucius as our history, as part of our history, part of our scholars, and we're proud of that past. And we will teach it to our children in our schools. Our beginning kindergarten classes will have stories of Confucius' life in them. We'll teach people to read with the Analects of Confucius, right? These are the sorts of things that happened in Taiwan, is they embraced their past and that. In mainland China, we had, in contrast, the Cultural Revolution, where they killed people, burned books, and said, and again, you can imagine how communist revolutionaries would view Confucius and his whole idea of you don't rebel, you don't cause, And so for them, instead of saying, the emperor and the republic lost the mandate of heaven and we've gained it, they said this whole idea of never rebelling is wrong. Confucius is wrong. All of this stuff is sexist, part of our past, and we need to just get rid of it. Well, I think we have some sort of an understanding of how well cultural purges of people's cultural history works. And the answer is it doesn't work very well, at least. They had some minor success, but it didn't succeed. And after the death of Mao, they reversed course. And again, you can imagine why now a communist party who is entrenched in power would appreciate this idea of harmony and protesting being bad, right? Those protesters, that's a Western thing. Confucius, this is not how we do it. Maybe we remonstrate, right? But we don't We don't foment rebellions. And so suddenly Confucius's star flips, and we get these Confucian institutes. This is a form of Chinese soft power where they will fund these institutes who will offer to teach people Chinese and attach them to various universities around from France to the United States. But they are funded by the Chinese Communist government, and they try to teach people Chinese culture, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself. We should learn more Chinese culture, but this is a form of soft power intentionally being exercised by the Chinese government. But they're using, notice how they're using Confucius and Confucian teachings to spread that power. It's almost night and day from the Cultural Revolution and the position of Mao. There still is some ambiguity, right, in the Communist Party about how to view, I think, Confucius, but there's certainly things going on there that are very different than what we saw. They look a lot more like Taiwan in that sense. And in fact, one of the other things is they took the pilgrimage sites of Confucius that they had actually torn down during Mao, and they built them up in the last 10 years, and they are beautiful now. Whereas 10 years ago, they were rubble piles. That's overstating it, but they were run down and badly damaged and graffitied and things. And now they're beautiful, clean, pristine, and China is hoping that people from Taiwan will come as tourists, visit those places, and bring better views of China back to Taiwan. And it's, again, part of their psychological, cultural forms of soft power as they try to influence things around the world. So now, I hope you don't mind, but I'm gonna take just a minute and ask, what do we do with this? Like, is there any value in it for us? And if there is, where is that value? And as I do this, I want to be careful, because I'm not trying to tell you that Western ideas like individualism and feminism and inequality are bad. I'm not, because if you know me, you know I believe in those things and that I believe in social justice. What I am going to try to say is that my debate teacher told me that steel manning is much better than straw manning. And a steel man argument is when you take the best position your opponent can make, and you make it better than they can, and you even grant that some of it is right. And then you say, and yet my position holds anyway. And so I want to do that, maybe some of this in that vein, not in a necessarily critique of all things Western vein. I want to start with two quotes from Stephen Prothero in his book, God is Not One. He says, Confucianism can be regarded as religious humanism. Secular humanists insist on emptying the world of the sacred. Confucius insists on infusing the world with sacred import. I think that would resonate very well with Unitarian Universalists. Would it not? He also says, transformation is a communal endeavor. In other words, if you read self-help books, that's all great, but you have to get together with other people. Instead of staying home and reading the internet, you come to church, to the Unitarian church, whatever it is, right? And maybe it's not because you believe in something about God, but you enjoy being with other people in community because you recognize it's in community that real transformation of ourselves and of society is best performed. This is a critique of I'm spiritual but not religious. There's a problem with spiritual but not religious, because the difference between spirituality and religion is the community aspect. And if you kick the community aspect out because you're so sick of the Catholic priests abusing children, so now I'm not going to have any community at all because I don't trust any community. It's trust in society and community that is lacking. And sometimes our institutions have earned that lack of trust, right? But that lack of trust also makes us alone. And not only can you not do communal change acting alone, you can't do individual change acting alone. And so recognizing that my community is bad, my community is going to do dumb things, we're going to hurt each other's feelings, we're going to make mistakes, and you know what, I'm here anyway, because we need that community. That's a very Confucian view. And I think, again, it's one that we as Unitarian Universalists would do good to kind of learn from, because maybe that's the story we have for why we're worth having at all. Why do people come here? Why aren't they just spiritual but not religious? Why do people come to a UU church? Well, maybe this is why. And maybe Confucius teaches us something about that. Two others. I want to do some contrasts here. If you look at Confucianism as hierarchical and communalist, not communist, but communalist, the West is highly equality-driven and individualist. Well, is there any value at all in the other view? And if so, what is that value and what is that danger? And again, this is where I'm going to step on my own opinions. But if you do this wrong, hierarchy, you end up with sexism, patriarchy, right? Where men are above women or whatever it is. On the other hand, if you do equality wrong, you can find equal problems. And I'm going to use this example because it's one I think that struck me very early in my life. I was on the ballroom dance team at BYU. I was on the backup of the backup of the backup team. But nevertheless, because they are also the world champion ballroom dance team in the world. And so I felt very honored to be on the backup of the backup of the backup for the best ballroom dance team in the world. But what do you do when you dance? Now, two things here. First of all, because there were more women trying out for the team than men, the women were often better than the men. There was more competition, so there were more of them, and they were desperate to find any man who can dance, and we'll put him on the team, right? And so I often, when practicing, I found myself in a situation, in a hierarchical situation, where the woman was better than I was, and I needed to listen to her as she taught me how to do this right. And if I thought I was her equal and refused, we would not have improved, and it would have been really bad. On the other hand, when we got into the dance floor, even though she was my teacher, our roles reversed. And the reason they reversed is because most dance steps, when I did foxtrot specifically, go that direction, and she's here and she's facing that direction, and she can't see where she's going. And I lead and she follows. She taught me how to do that, but when we're on the dance floor, I lead, she follows. And if we ever got into a moment where she was telling me to do one move and I was trying to tell her to do another move, we would fail miserably. There was no way for us to negotiate every step. I had to be good at leading, which means I would convey my intent for what step we were going to do next through my contact with her, and she would pick up on it instantly and follow. On the other hand, every once in a while there are things that happen backwards. I'll take a step this way, and if I'm someone over there, I might trip or fall or whatever. And she became very good dancers do this, at what we call back leading, which is where she gives me information about what's happening around me so that I can make the right steps when I step forward and when I step backward. So there were times when I followed and she led, especially in practice. And there were times when I led and she followed. And if we tried to move out of our own roles, it would not have worked. So, again, the problem is this steps very dangerously into what we just said of sexism, right? And the man's role is to lead, the woman's role. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is there are times when understanding a role and being willing to sit in it is beneficial. My grandfather had this saying that was probably too racist, but he would say that too many chiefs and not enough Indians make you lose the fight. And today I think if I were trying to modernize his saying, because I know what he was getting at, it was a very important point. If I were trying to modernize it, I would say something like too many coaches and not enough basketball players make for a really poor team. And it's true. You will all be in a role where you're expected to follow at some point, and you will all be in a role where you're expected to lead at some point. And no matter how egalitarian we try to make society, and I'm in favor of that, again, I want to be clear, no matter how in favor I am of that, you will still be in the role of a leader and a follower at some point in your life, and you have to, whether it's at work, because the boss is not the same as the student, or the boss of the employee. The boss and the employee are not the same. And you have to learn to work in those hierarchical situations. And I believe that Confucius' teachings about those hierarchies are actually probably the best way to make that work when you're in a situation where you have to make it work, where you can't be perfectly equal, when you're dealing with your boss and your boss is doing something wrong and you know it's wrong, what do? Remonstrance. How do you do it? Confucius taught us how. Right? And so there is, what I'm suggesting is that some of this I reject myself. Right? It creates a conservative society that is probably closed and dangerous and possibly sexist and leads to totalitarianism or whatever you want. But there's other aspects of this that we should at least look at and go, is there anything there that it can teach us? The other aspect that I think is really important is this individualism. The West is individualism almost run amok, and the result of that is loneliness. And communalism run amok is this place where we all have this dictated role, and if you don't fit in it, too bad, you just have to stay there. That's not what we want. But on the other hand, if you don't know what your role is, you often ask these questions like, what is my purpose in life? I don't have a purpose. But if you're Confucian, you have a purpose. You know exactly what your purpose is in every interaction you deal with because it's dictated to you. Neither of those extremes are healthy. And so somehow we have to find a balance between those extremes of loneliness and totalitarian authoritarianism or a dictatorship or the word I'm looking for is abusive hierarchy, right? Sexism, racism, classism, whatever that is, right? So somehow we have to find a way to balance these things. And I think as we try to do this, the writings of Confucius are, for me at least, eminently relevant and valuable. They're not just relics of the past with nothing to teach me, I don't believe. So let's assume you want to know more. Let me give you some suggestions. Books that matter from the Great Courses series, The Analects of Confucius by Professor Robert Andre Lefort, I think. This is the one I was suggesting to you would answer your question, I think in chapter 3 or 2 or 3, something like that. He talks about the composition of the text. And this is not a way to read the text, right? But he goes through them and teaches a course on the book's composition, on its interpretation, on its meaning, that sort of thing. I have recommended this book over and over again, But God Is Not One by Stephen Prothero. Confucianism is one of the religions that he actually has a section on. So there's a chapter on Confucianism, which is very, very good and worth reading. Cultural literacy for religion, everything the well-educated person should know. Lecture 8 was where a lot of my material last month came from. Lecture 9 is on Confucianism, and Lecture 10 is on Taoism. Not as much of my lecture today came from Lecture 9 as came from Lecture 8 last time. Nevertheless, this was very useful and good information about Confucianism. Great Mythologies of the World has at least 3 chapters that I believe are relevant. And Human History in the First Civilizations has, again, 3 chapters that are relevant. He has other chapters on Neo-Confucianism and things like that, which I went through and, again, decided I just didn't have time to talk about. From Yao to Mao, 5,000 Years of Chinese History. Again, several of these chapters are very relevant. One on Confucianism and Taoism, Lecture 5. The 100 Schools, Lecture 6. All of these are, and Neo-Confucianism in Lecture 19. Again, all of these are very relevant sections. This was a great study, not of religion per se, but of Chinese history. So I'll point out, I listened to all of this in preparation, so there you go. These are the many things I listened to over the last, some of this over the last year, but some of them over the last month. And this is something I don't always do. Normally I don't recommend other YouTube channels a lot, but I think we should. YouTube is being flooded by a bunch of AI nonsense, where people will ask an AI thing to write something inflammatory and crazy, and then write a catchy clickbait title, and then they'll have the AI speak the algorithm, and then they'll post it, and then they'll try to make money that way because YouTube pays creators. And a lot of the stuff on there is just not true. It's nonsensical. It's designed to catch people's attention. And so I want to point people at, I'm not always qualified to tell the difference between good stuff and bad stuff, but I know enough about comparative religion that I want to recommend Religion for Breakfast. This guy knows what he's talking about, and his videos are good, and the information in them is very good, and it's well balanced and thought out. And he has 3 videos on Confucianism that I all watched in preparation for this. An Intro to Confucian, Is Confucianism a Religion? Confucianism Making a Comeback in China. All three of these are very good, and I got some of the material from today from them, so I'm going to recommend another YouTube channel kind of for the first time. Okay, that's it. Next time we're going to talk about Taoism, and I hope to see you there, and I hope that the things we shared today will help you in your life's journey, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you. Go ahead, please. No, I got to let you talk at the end of this, and tell me all the things I did wrong, too. So, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
So you can see the influence of Confucianism in the way Chinese people reverse certain things. One is age. The older you are, the more revered you are. Second, teachers are highly revered. You can see that is Confucianism. When I was growing up, my parents were both teachers, so they're really, highly regarded in the society. I went to school at 6, but my mother started homeschooling me at 4 before I went to regular school so that I can skip a grade. So she made me memorize Confucian saying, and I don't understand it. But, you just have to memorize and repeat it. But she'll say, all right, today you're going to memorize this passage, like you would memorize Bible verses. And then she goes and works at the school. And when she comes back, I have to learn it the whole day so that I can recite back to her. So one of the things I remember that from the Confucian saying is, when a child misbehaves, it's the father's fault. When a student does not learn, it's the teacher's fault. So all the time on Facebook, you see parents, telling the world how wonderful their children are when they are doing good. But when the children do something bad, they don't say that. They just say, it's not my problem. They are individuals that develop their own. The English have a saying, you reap what you sow. So the children.
The other thing I think that's worth talking about, the reverence for teaching and the reverence for education is in many ways behind the miracle of the economic expansion in the Far East. And those are very Confucian values. And we see it in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. These places have exploded, and a lot of that economic miracle is because of their deep and abiding love of education. And if we had more of that in the West, so I was always of the opinion, my philosophical childhood religion was education is the answer to all of our problems, and if these kids in the school around me would stop, doing crazy stuff and getting drunk on the weekend and would actually pay attention in school, maybe we'd solve all the world's problems. And I was a Confucian and didn't know it. But yeah, education is the solution to the world's problems, and I can't help but resonate with that. Yeah, go ahead.
How does Confucianism reckon with democracy in the sense that, as you have this leaders and the rulers and then people who are the subjects and whatever, but in democracy, anyone can become a ruler. You just get enough votes somehow, and then you become that ruler for a while. Then you might get kicked back down here again. So how?
Anybody could become the Chinese official to the emperor, the prime official. Either all you had to do is ace the test. So these things are compatible, but there's Chinese thinkers spending a lot of time figuring out how to unify them and trying to decide how they should be unified. And there's obviously different approaches. It's not like I can speak for every Chinese philosopher who tries to unify democracy with Confucianism, but there are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can say Confucianism was feudal and is wrong. We're just going to ignore it. That's one way. You can also say Confucianism always thought that anyone could be a very powerful official. All you had to do is do well on the test. And now you have to do well in the election, and and hopefully we elect worthy people, because Confucianism was all about being worthy to rule by earning it by being a good whole person, which makes you a good ruler. So you should elect people like that. Which is why I think it was so unfair when I talked about, make China great again, because I think Confucius would take one look at Trump and say, heck no, right? That is not the sort of person that he would recommend as a leader. So do you have?
Well, what I was going to say though is that, because of that structure, then you had these people with these high values assumed because they passed the test. But in ours,
They knew about the high values. Did they have them? Confucius was all about, how you should have them and you should put them into action. It was about self-cultivation. And the problem with the later tests was it was about knowing the words, but had you really cultivated them? This was, I think, the problem with the tests. But if they had cultivated them, they would be the exact sort of person I would want to be a leader. But I'm not sure they had internalized them in the same way just because they had memorized them and could write a good essay. I think that technique failed to properly pick people that Confucius himself would have been happy to have as the leaders. But that, again, this is my opinion, right?
yeah, but what I'm saying is that they would not like the way we do our democracy because there is no test. All you need is to find people who might have the same work values as you, which is carry
This is true.
whatever, guns and whatever. So, it's kind of like a sad commentary on maybe how we're educating
True.
our next level of politicians.
And how we I don't think, there are, the founders of our country complained about democracy. They actually thought it was bad because people tend to pick bad leaders. They just didn't think it was as bad as a monarchy, right? And they're not wrong. But if we had, perhaps, now I'm going to say something again controversial, if we had more of a Confucian view of what would make a good leader, maybe we would pick better leaders. Because maybe the problem isn't just that we vote for our leaders, the problem is we pick dumb leaders when we vote for them because we haven't taught ourselves what sort of people we should pick as good leaders. And Confucius has a lot to say about that we could find a value. Go ahead, yeah.
So I think the way Chinese government are formed and pick their leader is the most democratic in the whole world. Because they're coming up in the strata. You start with the slowest one, like the district elect the leader. And then the next level, they elect themselves. And it goes all the way up. I don't know how many levels it is before you can go to the top.
So it's not elected by the people, it's elected by the next group.
The next group, the first group is, everybody gets to vote in their little district. So Los Alamos will have one representative. And then Santa Fe will have one, whatever. And then they all get together and vote in another group. So as it goes bigger, the whole country is involved in the top leadership.
Weirdly, I get the impression that's what the Electoral College was supposed to be about, because our founders did not want us electing our leaders directly because they thought we would do a bad job. And so the role of the Electoral College was we would elect good people to the Electoral College, and then those people would elect a good leader and wouldn't be swayed by, kind of the crazy whims of the mass. That is not how it works today at all. But I think that's what it was sort of for originally. It's just not how it works. And we have devolved well into a discussion of politics far. But again, I don't think you can talk about Confucianism without talking about politics. For him, everything was about how to properly run a state. And that's what it was about. So yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
I just want to throw this out, just what's rolling in my head is, it seems like we're talking in some ways about meritocracy.
Yes, it's a very
We have
meritocracy.
sort of, in this country, but it's got a lot of sort of ifs, ands, and buts in it. But still, there's sort of a philosophical belief in that. And we're trying to also, at the same time, hold equal opportunity in this country. So, I don't know, those
That's
are
fair.
to me like some key issues that are, how does Confucianism relate to what America's trying to do?
The test idea was supposed to set up something of a meritocracy or a technocratocracy. The right way to say that is, you know what I'm talking about. That's what it was supposed to do. I don't know if it succeeded. At the same time, we believe in this whole equality and everybody's the same, and yet we're supposed to set up some sort of a meritocracy through voting. And again, we also fail. So I don't know how to do this right, but to some extent, there's something similar going on with what we want.
And that, I would say, we started with one idea of what equal opportunity meant, and we've been trying to create a different idea of what equal opportunity means for 250 years.
Yep.
And we're still not finished with that project, and it makes the whole meritocracy thing very complicated.
This is true. Did you?
Yeah, I was wondering, in the many, many sayings that come out, are any of them the least bit suggestive of empiricism? Value of finding by...
So I know this is something you care deeply about, and so do I, right? How do we know what's true is important, and empiricism is the best way to decide what's true. I don't think that was primarily his goal. He wasn't interested in what was true. He was interested about how to live a good life and be a good leader and have a good society. I don't think I can properly answer your question, because you asked if there's any statement anywhere in there, and I would have to go back and A, reread the ones I've read looking for that, and then B, read the few I've missed. So that was not I can put it this way, that was not a chapter in the lectures on the Book of the Analects on empiricism, right? There was no section on that. It wasn't one of the emphasized points. So, any other thoughts? All right, we've gone over for quite a while, but we've had good conversation after. Thank you. I'll see you next time.